The War of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that ravaged England in the 15th century, had its origins in the complex relationships and claims of two rival houses, Lancaster and York. The name War of the Roses comes from the symbols associated with these houses, the red rose for Lancaster and the white rose for York. However, this conflict wasn't just a straightforward contest between two families but was influenced by economic, social, and political turmoil that plagued England during this period. The feud between the houses of Lancaster and York stemmed from their shared descent from King Edward III, who ruled from 1327 to 1377. The seeds of discord were sown when King Richard II, Edward's grandson, was deposed in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. The reign of Henry VI and the early stages of the war. The reign of Henry VI, who became king as an infant in 1422, was marked by instability. Henry VI was not a strong ruler, and his periods of mental illness exacerbated the already tense political situation. By the mid-15th century, the English nobility was divided, with powerful figures aligning themselves with either the Lancastrian or Yorkist causes. The Yorkist claim to the throne was championed by Richard, Duke of York, who was a descendant of King Edward III through both his mother and father, giving him a strong claim to the throne. In 1450, tensions escalated when Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector during one of Henry VI's periods of mental incapacity. This appointment gave him significant power and effectively sidelined Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had been acting as regent for her husband. Queen Margaret, a staunch supporter of the Lancastrian cause, opposed Richard's growing influence and began to gather support for the king. The First Battle of St. Albans and the Yorkist victory. The first armed conflict of the War of the Roses took place on May 22, 1455, at the Battle of St. Albans. The Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, and his ally, the Earl of Warwick, emerged victorious. This battle marked the beginning of open warfare between the two factions. Although Henry VI was captured by the Yorkists, Richard did not immediately seek to depose him. Instead, he sought to control the king and the government. Despite the Yorkist victory at St. Albans, hostilities continued to simmer. Queen Margaret remained a powerful figure in the Lancastrian camp, and she worked tirelessly to rally support for her husband and son, Prince Edward of Westminster. Over the next few years, the conflict grew more intense as both sides gathered more support. The Battle of Wakefield and the death of Richard, Duke of York. The fragile peace between the Yorkists and Lancastrians collapsed completely in 1460, leading to renewed fighting. One of the most significant early events was the Battle of Wakefield on December 30, 1460. This battle saw the death of Richard, Duke of York, a major blow to the Yorkist cause. Richard's son, Edward, Earl of March, inherited his father's claim to the throne and became the leader of the Yorkist faction. Despite the setback at Wakefield, the Yorkists quickly rebounded under the leadership of Edward. On February 2, 1461, Edward defeated the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. This victory paved the way for Edward to march on London, where he was declared King Edward IV on March 4, 1461, the ascension of Edward IV and the Battle of Towton. Edward IV's rise to power was not uncontested. The Lancastrian forces, led by Queen Margaret, regrouped and prepared to challenge Edward's claim to the throne. The decisive battle between the two sides occurred on March 29, 1461, at Towton, the largest and bloodiest battle of the War of the Roses. Estimates suggest that around 50,000 men took part in the battle, with as many as 28,000 casualties. The Yorkists, under Edward IV, achieved a resounding victory, forcing the Lancastrians to flee. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and their son went into exile in Scotland and later in France. Edward IV's victory at Towton secured his hold on the English throne, and he was formally crowned on June 28, 1461. However, the Lancastrian cause was not extinguished, and the next few years saw intermittent fighting between the two sides. The reign of Edward IV and the Warwick Rebellion. Edward IV's reign was marked by relative stability in its early years, but by the late 1460s, tensions began to surface within the Yorkist camp. The Earl of Warwick, one of Edward's most powerful supporters, grew disillusioned with the king, particularly after Edward married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. This marriage angered many of the nobles, as Elizabeth came from a relatively modest background, and her family quickly gained influence at court. Warwick, feeling marginalized, switched his allegiance to the Lancastrians, forming an alliance with Queen Margaret and Louis XI of France. In 1469, Warwick launched a rebellion against Edward IV. Initially successful, Warwick even managed to restore Henry VI to the throne in October 1470, during what is known as the readeption of Henry VI. However, Warwick's triumph was short-lived, the return of Edward IV and the fall of Warwick. In 1471, Edward IV returned from exile with the support of his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and other loyal Yorkists. Edward's forces clashed with Warwick's at the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471. Warwick was killed in the battle, and the Lancastrian cause suffered a significant blow. Just a few weeks later, on May 4, 1471, Edward IV defeated the remaining Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Prince Edward of Westminster, the son of Henry VI and Queen Margaret, was killed in the battle, effectively ending the Lancastrian line. With his rivals defeated, Edward IV resumed his reign, and Henry VI, who had been briefly restored to the throne, was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he died on May 21, 1471, likely murdered on Edward's orders. The end of Edward IV's reign and the ascension of Richard III. Edward IV ruled relatively peacefully until his death on April 9, 1483. His death led to a new phase of political instability, as his 12-year-old son, Edward V, was set to succeed him. However, Edward V's reign was short-lived. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared Edward and his younger brother, Richard, illegitimate, and took the throne for himself as Richard III on June 26, 1483. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother, known as the Princes in the Tower, remains one of the most famous mysteries in English history. Many historians believe that Richard III had them killed to secure his hold on the throne, the rise of Henry Tudor and the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III's reign was marked by discontent, particularly among those who had supported Edward IV. Among those who opposed Richard was Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian relative with a claim to the throne. Henry Tudor, who had been living in exile in France, returned to England in 1485 to challenge Richard III for the crown. The decisive battle between the two sides took place on August 22, 1485, at Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor's forces defeated Richard III, who was killed in the battle, making Henry the last English king to die in combat. With Richard's death, the Yorkist cause was effectively extinguished, and Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII. The end of the War of the Roses and the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII's ascension to the throne marked the end of the War of the Roses. To solidify his rule and unify the country, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, in 1486. This marriage symbolically united the houses of Lancaster and York, ending decades of conflict. Henry VII went on to establish the Tudor dynasty, which ruled England for over a century. His reign brought much-needed stability to the country, and he worked diligently to restore royal authority and strengthen the monarchy. The War of the Roses had left England devastated, but under the Tudors, the nation began to recover and lay the foundations for its future as a major European power. The War of the Roses was one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Lasting from 1455 to 1487, it involved a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting power dynamics. The conflict pitted the houses of Lancaster and York against each other in a struggle for the English throne, leading to numerous battles and a great deal of bloodshed. The war came to an end with the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, which brought stability to a war-torn country. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field not only ended the conflict but also ushered in a new era for England, one marked by political consolidation and the strengthening of the monarchy. The legacy of the War of the Roses can still be seen today in English history and culture, symbolizing the dangers of civil strife and the fragility of political power.